Welcome to Movie Oubliette, the film review podcast for movies that most people have mercifully forgotten.
I'm Dan.
And I'm Conrad, and in each episode, we drag a forsaken film out of the oubliette,
Discuss it and judge it to decide whether it should be set free
or whether it should be thrown back and consigned to oblivion forever. We review the films others tend to forget. Come with us and open up the Movie Oubliette. Hello and welcome to Movie Oubliette, the trans-hemispherical podcast for forgotten fantastical films with me, Conrad, all the way up in Cambridge, UK.
And me, Dan, in the hipster capital of the world, Melbourne, Australia.
We'll be focusing on fantastic films, as I mentioned, so sci-fi, horror, and fantasy for the most part, just because those are the only films that get us excited. Dan, how are you?
I am very well today, staying on top of things, and it's warming up here, so that's always a good thing.
Yeah, it's getting steadily colder here, so I'm in my element, which is great.
Great. So, Conrad, what's in the mailbag today?
Well, we had a lovely email from Lena. She wrote just to say how much she's enjoying listening to you and Dan talking about films. Such a delight, even though I haven't watched any of the films you're talking about. Apart from Willow. I wonder if that's true of many of the people listening, that they don't actually watch the film.
Well, I know it's true for a lot of my friends, because I know they don't watch a huge amount of horror. But yeah, it's still good to know that it's entertaining despite not watching the movies.
Yeah. She also asked if we would ever consider talking about The Princess Bride, which is her favourite movie. But I'm not sure whether we could class that as being in the oubliette. I think it's probably very successful and very well known.
Yes, unfortunately it is a bit too well known. Not quite in our wheelhouse.
Yeah. She also suggested The Ghost and Mrs. Muir from 1947.
Ah, well, that's a movie I think we could do. It's actually one I included in my thesis when I was studying audio. So it would be great to talk about that, actually.
You'd be prepared.
I would be.
That's cheating.
Any other messages or emails from people?
So we had a tweet from Serge of Cold Crash Pictures, our friend from a previous episode.
Hey, Serge.
Hey, Serge. He was saying that he saw both of the Haunting films back in the early 2000s and had a clear preference for the remake, but only because that was the one that was in colour. Oh, how times have changed.
Despicable. How dare he?
But this is the thing. He did point out that at the time his favourite shows were basically the family Saturday morning lineup. So
oh, no.
Makes me feel a little bit old. But there we go.
Me too.
I mean, the other exciting thing that I should mention is that we got a mention on the UK's leading film review podcast and radio show. We were on Radio 4, if you can believe it or not.
What?
Yeah. So Kermode and Mayo's film review show, which is on Radio 4, I tweet at them occasionally. And Mark Kermode, who is the critic, was sitting down in the cinema to watch The Nun a week ago, and was bracing himself because he wasn't particularly looking forward to it, I don't think. And he has a thing that he talks about. He hates modern horror movies that are just quiet, bang. You know, it's just, they're not creepy or suspenseful. It's just long periods of silence followed by a really loud stinger that makes you jump, because it's not very sophisticated horror. And he's always talking about quiet, bang. So when he said he was going to watch The Nun, I tweeted back at him, quiet, nun. Which was pretty much my experience of the trailer, actually, that it's just sort of quiet. Here's a nasty nun. So, yeah. So they memed it on the show and tweeted about it. And in this week's episode, Mark actually gave credit where credit is due and said that the quiet nun came from us. So he's a scholar and a gentleman.
Yes. I would say it came from you specifically, Conrad. But always good to get a mention.
It is, yeah. So, Dan, what have you got for us to review this week?
Well, I'm going to go fetch it from the oubliette. Okay, I've got a canine helper today.
Oh.
My good trusty sheepdog, Gary.
Oh, hello, Gary.
Hang on, I just need to open the oubliette for you, though. Okay, Gary, go get him.
Wow, look at him go.
Oh, it smells like a farm in here. All right.
Oh my god, the feng shui in this room is terrible.
Thanks, Gary. You can go off and chase some ducks or something. Okay, so the movie we'll be taking a look at today is a movie from 2006 from my home country, New Zealand. It is Black Sheep.
Ah, so this is the 2006 horror comedy film and not the one with Chris Farley in it.
No, this is, just to be clear, listeners, this is not the 1996 kooky comedy starring Chris Farley and David Spade. So this movie is written and directed by Jonathan King, and it stars a plethora of New Zealand actors, including Nathan Meister, Peter Feeney, Oliver Driver, Tandy Wright, Tammy Davis, and Danielle Mason. And I was actually surprised to find out that only 3 of those actors were in Shortland Street, which is the only soap opera from New Zealand that has been going on since I don't even know, that everyone watches and is terrible. There's kind of a running joke in New Zealand that every actor starts off on Shortland Street.
Okay.
As it is also the running joke in Australia that every actor starts off on Home and Away or Neighbours. So
Yes. Okay, so what's the general premise of Black Sheep?
So the film opens up on the characters Henry and Angus Oldfield as young kids working with their dad on their family farm. Angus then pulls a prank on Henry involving a sheep's carcass that terrifies Henry, and coupled with the sudden news of the father's untimely death, Henry develops a phobia of sheep. Cut to 15 years later, Henry returns to the family farm to settle some family business with his brother, but also to deal with his fear of sheep. Meanwhile, 2 environmentalists, Grant and a girl called Experience, are investigating a research lab on the Oldfields farm and escape with an experimented on sheep fetus in a jar. During the getaway, the fetus container is dropped and smashes, releasing the still alive fetus. Proceeds to bite Grant's ear off. Then the fetus manages to bite another sheep, and thus starting an outbreak of zombie sheep, or as the film coins, were sheep. So we follow the unlikely group of an environmentalist, an ovinophobic city boy, a farmhand, and a lovely old lady, custodian of the farm, Mrs. Mack, as they try to rectify the situation of herds of zombie, flesh-eating, rampaging, woolly sheep. And there we have it.
Okay. That sounds great. Let's take a break and get into it.
Yes. We'll be right back. So we're back to discuss Black Sheep. Thoughts, Conrad?
So I had never seen Black Sheep before, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of it from the cover and from the description, because I thought, is this meant to be taken semi-seriously? Is it supposed to be, a genuine proposition, an outbreak of zombie sheep? But pretty much as soon as the environmentalist Grant is attacked by what is obviously a puppet mutant sheep fetus on his ear and starts stumbling around the forest with it. I was pretty much at home with, okay, I get what the tone of this movie is. This is sort of it's very much in the tradition of Peter Jackson's early splatter works, so things like Bad Taste and Brain Dead, which is known in the US as Dead Alive. It's so and I in the making of, I noticed that they were all talking about this as being a very New Zealand story, and I was wondering if you can just enlighten me and our audience as to exactly why there is a peculiar New Zealand thing about ridiculous splatterfests, because I'm not quite sure where this comes from.
I mean, I feel like New Zealand does a lot of horror, but it never does it seriously. It's always black comedy horror. I think it's a mindset of New Zealanders as well, because New Zealanders really don't think of New Zealand as being that great. I mean, apart from the scenery, which they go on about. But in terms of the people, we're always a little bit modest, and we're always a little bit reserved, and I think they've taken that saying that, you know, New Zealanders and Australian, we all just have sex with sheep, and they've kind of taken that ridiculousness and turned that into a movie about killer sheep. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's New Zealanders just kind of taking the piss at themselves and making a ridiculous movie.
Yeah, well, it's definitely that. I mean, I saw one review where the comment was that there are elements of it that could be offensive if it were in any way plausible, but because the film is not attempting to be plausible at all, you just roll with it. You just let the ridiculousness of it just roll on by.
But I mean, I feel at the same time they put enough effort into a production value and semi-decent acting and set design, so it does portray across as it is a horror film. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it is still a decently made horror film. Because, you know, you look at like trauma films and that's just too far. They've taken it too far, and to most people it's just terrible. But they tried to make a decent film.
Yeah.
Knowing the premise was ridiculous.
Yes, but I mean, it certainly pushes the boundaries and does things that you would not see in a Hollywood movie. I think it's fair to say.
Yes.
I mean, some of the stuff involving Henry's brother, Angus, and his particular relationship with the sheep.
Yes.
Not something that you would see explored elsewhere.
No.
In a major studio movie. I mean, it must have been quite fun for established organizations like Weta, because Weta, of course, collaborated on the effects, even though the budget, I would imagine, was very small. But it really looked like them going back to their roots, because Richard Taylor from Weta has been with Peter Jackson since Brain Dead, I think. And this must have been quite fun for them to go back to doing something that's just as ridiculously silly as this. I mean, you see elements of this kind of blood and guts and monsters in Lord of the Rings, but they've never been able to be this outlandish and silly with it.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a throwback to where they started with the early Peter Jackson films. But it's also worth mentioning that Weta also do other non-Peter Jackson movies as well. So they have done the effects for Lord of the Rings, obviously. But I think they did a lot of the weapon design for Hellboy. They did a lot of the CGI robotic stuff for District 9 and Elysium. So they know what they're doing, and they kind of took the whole B-grade 80s splatterfest genre and just ran with it. And they knew they weren't making something that looked realistic. You know, you've got the sheep feeders puppet, which you know is just an animatronic puppet that the guy is just pretending to struggle with. But it's hilarious, and because it's such a throwback to 80s horror, I think it was really well executed in terms of creating effects that were gross and horrific, but at the same time obviously fake and hilarious. So, yeah.
If we have a look at the whole plot of the film, you've got the two brothers, one of whom has stayed with the farm and has this vision of modernizing the farm with genetic engineering, which of course goes horribly wrong, resulting in these evil sheep. I mean, they're not actually zombies. I've seen them referred to as zombie sheep, but I don't think they're actually zombies. They're just ravenous genetic mutations of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the credits they're titled as were-sheep, so the whole a play on the whole werewolf mythology, I guess. But yeah, so you've got the sheep, and once they're infected, they just become rabid, flesh-eating animals. But once they bite a human, that human turns into this sheep human werewolf hybrid that is huge. So yeah, there's I guess its own thing.
Yeah. If there's a story, it's sort of Henry coming to terms with this childhood trauma where his brother, I mean, it should be said his brother's a bit of a dick, isn't he?
Oh.
He murders Henry's favourite pet sheep that he has tied up in their yard, and then turns its carcass into some hideous costume to scare him with when he goes into a barn. And is it the mother or is it Mrs. Mack that turns up? It's Mrs. Mack, isn't it?
I think it's Mrs. Mack, yes.
Yeah, so Mrs. Mack turns up and says something like, "Oh, Angus, pull your head in," or something.
Yes.
And I think that's something of an underreaction to finding somebody having murdered an animal and be running around in its carcass scaring people.
But I mean, I guess that it's the whole idea of farmers. They're used to slaughtering animals all the time, so having a sheep's carcass worn as a costume maybe isn't such a stretch.
Yeah, it's just average roughhousing on the farm. And then suddenly shifts gears to let them know that their fathers died having plunged off a cliff. As a result, Henry gets this phobia of sheep and leaves the island, maybe. I'm not sure. It's not made entirely clear whether he leaves.
He leaves the farm for sure.
Yeah. And
he moves to the city.
Moves to the city, right. Okay. So then he comes back to sort of sell his share in the farm so his brother can get on with his plans. And his brother's arranging this big event so that he can show off to other farmers this human sheep hybrid that he's come up with.
this perfect sheep, yes.
The most beautiful sheep that you've ever seen, who apparently in the making of material they say was a bit of a diva.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Hilarious.
Apparently she was terrible, would not perform. So he's got this big event. And you've got the environmentalists who are trying to figure out what's going on this laboratory, and they unleash this genetic abortion of a human sheep hybrid, and as a result create a were-sheep and this whole outbreak of evil flesh-eating sheep on the rampage. And so it's sort of the characters trying to escape from all of this and sort it all out. So that's sort of the shape of the thing. In terms of character arcs, I suppose you've got Henry getting over his sheep phobia.
Yes.
Does he really?
I think he does. I think
he sort of conquers it, I suppose. In terms of resolving his relationship with his brother, yeah, I'm not sure that works out quite so well. He doesn't kill him, does he? Yes, he does.
Well, he attempts to. So he attempts to kill his brother. His brother doesn't die. His brother goes towards the rabid sheep and says something like, "Turn me back into a sheep," or something, and then they proceed to just eat him alive. But first, ripping off his genitals, which is a horrific shot.
It is, and not what I was expecting at all. Yeah, so the brother gets his comeuppance not at the hand of his younger brother, but at the hands of his misguided creation.
Exactly.
After he's had a horrible scene earlier on where, well, you don't actually see it, but it's heavily implied that he and his beautiful, perfect sheep that was a bit of a diva have had a rather romantic time in his office.
Yeah, he's just standing there in his underwear smoking a cigarette because as we know, people always smoke cigarettes after having sex.
They do. Yeah, so in terms of character arcs, that's sort of what you've got. There's the character of the environmentalist Experience. I had a few quandaries about her because it seemed to me that they were trying to have their cake and eat it with her. Because at the beginning, when she's with Grant, the other environmentalist, who seems to be a bit of a clusterfuck, to be honest, he's supposed to be going in, observing, collecting evidence and getting out without being discovered. But it's a total disaster. He gets spotted by everybody, falls over a fence, and they're all coming after them. It's a disaster. So she seems to me as though she's quite level-headed and practical and dedicated to her cause and sensible. And yet at other times in the movie, they depict her pretty much as a space cadet who's really not in touch with what's happening at any given moment. So you have the scene where, and it is a great line, where Henry and Experience and Tucker, who's a farmhand and childhood friend of Henry's, they go into a farmhouse that's they can see smoke coming out of, and they discover this kitchen that's wrecked. It's totally trashed, and there's blood smeared up the walls, and you can tell something terrible has happened here. And the guys are really scared and worried about what's happened. And she says, "Oh my God, the feng shui in this room is terrible," which is hilarious. But in terms of a consistent characterization for Experience, she kind of seems to be whatever she needs to be in any given scene to get a joke, which seems a little unfair. Henry is emasculated and neurotic and the butt of various jokes throughout the whole film. But it's consistent with her. It just seems to be that she's whatever the film needs her to be at any given time.
I would have to disagree because I found all the characters. So we've got Tucker, who's the farmhand, who's played by Tammy Davis, who is an institution in terms of young actors because he was in the TV show Outrageous Fortune, which is highly popular in New Zealand.
Okay.
Anyway, you've got Tucker, who is the grizzled, kind of no-nonsense, says it how it is farmhand. And then you've got Experience, who is someone I have met many times in New Zealand. And, growing up, going through university, there is always someone that is a bit of a hippie, that's vegan, that is a advocate for, Greenpeace and environmental things, but doesn't really know what they're talking about. So they'll spout off a string of words that they think is important, but they don't really know what they're talking about. So I found her character highly hilarious. And then the other characters, you've got Henry, who is just petrified and scared of life, really, but really isn't at the same time. He's pretty level-headed most of the time. And then you've got his brother, who's just your typical buttoned up, suited businessman that will do anything to make a lot of money. So I thought the characters were actually quite well defined, and I'm glad that they weren't your stereotypical American horror characters. There wasn't the jock or the really scantily clad hot girl or the stoner. Like, it was a good range of very almost cliche but New Zealand cliche characters that I think a lot of New Zealanders would really identify with and have met all of those people in their life at some stage.
Yeah. And Mrs. Mack as well, I think, is sort of a New Zealand institution too. I mean, certainly I recognise that similarly no-nonsense, down-to-earth matriarch of the farm who will, without batting an eyelid, pull a rabbit to pieces in the kitchen, which She does, and she comes up with some fantastic sayings. I think the first thing she says on screen is "bugger me days," which is not a phrase I had ever heard before and had me roaring with laughter.
Right. Yes. There are definitely a lot of sayings in the movie that I wasn't even sure whether other people understand, because I don't even know. There are sayings I've heard all my life, but I don't even know whether they're primarily from New Zealand or they're from the UK, or I don't know. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to hear your favorite quotes in the movies.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the characters, I guess the one thing that I noted is that you could characterize them as being typical of the horror comedy of the early noughties. So I'm thinking about Shaun of the Dead, I'm thinking about Zombieland, where your male protagonist is a neurotic nerd and your female protagonist is a what do they call them? Manic pixie dream girl. But they are very specific New Zealand versions of those. So the manic pixie dream girl is actually a bit of a ditzy mess and not all that much of a dream, bit of a nightmare, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the other environmentalist as well, Grant, is someone I have met numerous times as well. Just someone that is very self-righteous and very steadfast in their views and not even accepting any form of other viewpoint or discussion and will go and protest every weekend. And I don't know, I found the characters very identifiable, and that's why they were so hilarious.
What I like about Experience, though, is the times where she's surprised that any of her sort of new age claptrap actually works.
Yes.
She seems, it sort of hints at her being a little bit more with it than the movie lets her be a lot of the time. So
That's true.
when Henry is trying to leave the aforementioned house after they've been attacked by herds of evil flesh-eating sheep, and there's a herd of them that they're trying to get through slowly and quietly without rousing their bloodlust. And Experience is trying to use sort of mindfulness centering techniques to get him to calm down so that he can get out of there. And she's describing, you're a tree, feel your roots in the earth and draw your power from the earth. And he says that it works. It actually helps him. And she says, really? She's sort of surprised that her own bullshit actually does something. So I don't know. I sort of gave her more credit than the film did sometimes. I think that was...
Yeah. I love that scene as well because so she's managed to calm Henry down, and then Tucker proceeds to just destroy all the calm by honking his horn and just shout, "Get in the fucking truck!"
Yeah, after he says another one of my favorite New Zealand lines, which is "rattle your dags, Henry," which I knew what a dag was because I remember looking it up when I was a child watching Neighbours because nobody knew. Every time Jason Donovan called Mike a dag or whatever, everybody here didn't have any idea what he was talking about. But yes,
Right.
we found out. So it's clumps of poo hanging off a sheep's bum.
It is. It surely is.
So rattling your dags is it's sort of shake a tail feather, but revolting.
Yeah, exactly. There was another reference to New Zealand farm humour at the end where Mrs. Mac offers some mountain oysters to the characters and everyone says no apart from Experience, and then she finds out that mountain oysters are sheep testicles. Which is it's been a joke since I remember hearing that when I was really young, and I think farmers will continue to tell that joke to everyone. Yeah. So this movie was directed by Jonathan King, who I have only seen, I think, a couple of his other movies. They've all been very New Zealand-centric movies, though. So I think he did an adaptation of Under the Mountain, which is also an adaptation of a very classic New Zealand childhood book called Under the Mountain by Morris G. But yeah, I think he's doing okay. I really like the direction of this movie, but it was very, reminiscent of movies like Shaun of the Dead. which was obviously a homage to all the kind of 80s and 70s like zombie movies. So yeah, I think he did it well. It was a nice tribute, and also he didn't make it too modern as well. They weren't, talking on their smartphones all the time or trying to use technology. It was more of a just fight or flight kind of movie where they were just trying to survive by using the environment and the things around them, which was nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly Shaun of the Dead sets a pretty high bar for this kind of horror comedy, and Edgar Wright's gone on to develop that very musical sense of timing of construction of scenes and sequences up until Baby Driver, where it's pushed to the nth degree. And I don't see anything of that in Jonathan King's work. It's much more, as you say, a homage to the 80s schlockfest. It reminds me very much of a young Peter Jackson. And the only thing that disappoints me in terms of the direction is the action scenes. And I think it's probably just a side effect of the budget and the amount of time that they had, because the action scenes tend to fall back on just wobbling the camera around an awful lot. And sometimes in some of the encounters, you couldn't really tell what was going on.
I would agree that the action scenes were a little bit forgettable. Like you could tell that I don't think they had a full were-sheep monster. I think they had parts of it, and so you could only ever see parts of it. You could just see the head or the hoof, I think it purely is a budget issue. I couldn't find the budget of this movie, actually. I tried searching for it and I just couldn't find it. But I'm assuming it was very low.
Yeah.
But I found like all the gore effects were amazing. Like all the intestines and body parts and and flesh and people with their faces half eaten off were impeccable in terms of realism. Whereas some of the were sheep monster effects they could have been a little bit better.
Yeah, a lot of them they looked very wetter. They looked very much like trolls, and so it was kind of difficult to see the sheep influence on the were sheep. They just looked sort of like monsters, sort of stereotypical monsters, where I would have liked to have seen more of an ovine influence on the designs coming through. But yes, I actually had to look up to see that it was ovine, because I thought it's bovine for cow. What is it for sheep? And it's ovine, apparently.
I had to look that up too. You've got the rabbit sheep. So that was just pretty much a sheep with blood smeared on its mouth. And then you've got the extreme were sheep. So Grant turns into one, and so does Angus, Henry's brother. They turn into these monstrous, massive were sheep. And then you've got the kind of intermediate were sheep as well. So I think Tucker turns into one, and it does resemble a bit of a werewolf, but a bit rounder, I guess. And I found that quite ovine-esque. There was the kind of big bulbous sheep eyes and round face and kind of ratty sheep teeth,
tufts of white hair coming through.
Yeah. I thought that the intermediate sheep monster was actually quite cool.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things they mentioned was that one of the things that happens to Angus is his top teeth start to fall out. And because they point out that sheep don't actually have a top row of teeth. And although I commend them on their accuracy there, it does raise a slight problem with the premise of bloodthirsty meat-eating sheep, which is that they can't actually bite you by all accounts.
Okay.
If you want one to bite you, you have to push your finger way back into their cheek teeth, apparently. So I'm not quite sure how they would drag your intestines out with just a bottom row of teeth, unfortunately.
It's one of those movies you really had to suspend your disbelief. Like you really, really had to, and just run with it. And enjoy the ride.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's not trying to go for verisimilitude here. You're not supposed to look at this and think, wow, this could really happen.
Let's talk about acting now. Most of the acting was pretty good, but there was some pretty sketchy acting as well. I found Experience, who was played by Danielle Mason. Yeah, some dodgy acting from her.
Yes, and maybe that's behind the inconsistency that I was detecting, because maybe the character was written a certain way and just came across as inconsistent. But
Yeah.
whereas Nathan Meister, is that how you
Yes.
would say his name?
Yeah.
Who I looked him up, and he's got a very impressive roster of films like Avatar and The Hobbit and all this. But I mean, I think he's just sort of in the background in these films rather than
Yes.
in a leading role. I thought he was very good, actually, in terms of playing Henry and getting the mode of performance right, because that's the tricky thing in a horror comedy that's as ludicrous as this. It's setting your mode of performance so that it's the same tone as the rest of the movie, so that it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but not too knowing, but not too serious and realistic and gritty, because that would be wrong. He sort of gets the level just about right, and the same for Tammy Davis as well, I think. I think the two of them, they pitch it exactly right, whereas Danielle Mason maybe wasn't quite as sure of herself in this kind of context. I don't know.
It could be just due to just experience. Like, I looked up her other films, and she hasn't done a huge amount. So yeah, maybe she's just a bit inexperienced.
Yeah.
I also found the actor that played Angus, so Henry's brother, played by Peter Feeney, was really good.
Yeah.
Like, he was a douchebag. I just wanted to punch him all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you didn't have any trouble hating him right from the very beginning, where he's patronizing those two farmhands that are trying to help him out with his presentation.
Yeah.
You thought, what a dick. But yeah, he does that really well. And yeah, he has some ridiculous things to do that aren't very dignified in the movie. But he seems pretty game and throws himself into them.
Yeah.
And he's very good even when he's covered in makeup as well. He's very good at keeping that character and trying to let sort of sheep influences come out.
Yeah.
Like that ridiculous moment where he says bastard and says bastard.
Yeah.
It's just a terrible, terrible line and a really dumb gag, but he manages to pull it off reasonably well, I thought, or as well as could be.
I think that some of the acting doesn't help as well with some of it was very, very obviously ADR'd and not quite synced up to their lips. And so it made certain scenes a little stilted.
Yeah, and apparently it was the wind that was the problem.
It was filmed in Wairarapa, which is about an hour, 2 hours drive from Wellington, where I'm actually from. So Wellington and Wairarapa as well are known for being very windy all the time. So it's no surprise that it was windy on location.
Yeah, they mention it a couple of times in the commentary. Was, oh no, this is ADR'd because it was so windy that day. So it's
Yeah, sure.
yeah.
Now it's time for Random Trivia.
Yes, it's trivia time. Dan, what fascinating facts have you got for us on Black Sheep?
Well, there's a scene towards the beginning. It's one of the first sheep deaths, or human deaths by sheep. So it features Mike, the other farmer, and he's in his house and he's reading a book. And that book is called The Penguin History of New Zealand, which is quite a famous book in New Zealand, but it is written by Dr. Michael King, who is the father of director Jonathan King.
Ah, but and why would a farmer be reading it? Was he just brushing up on his
On the history of New Zealand? Well, I don't know. There are many long nights on farms, so
Maybe he's new.
maybe. So that was very interesting. Another bit of trivia: the scene with on the Land Rover with Tucker wrestling with that sheep. So that scene took several days to film, apparently.
Wow.
And the scene where the Land Rover goes over the cliff was done in one take.
Wow. Okay. They probably couldn't afford to do it multiple times.
Probably not.
Well, I got a fun piece of trivia from the commentary, if you would like to hear that.
Oh, of course.
So one of my favourite lines, "Rattle your dags, Henry." Apparently, the director was rather amused that when this was translated to French, it was translated as just "Courage, Henry."
Wow. Okay. No translation.
For dangling bits of sheep poo.
No.
This is a concept that is entirely alien to the French, which is
right.
Great for them.
It is.
And so that's our random trivia.
Yes.
In terms of cinematography, I thought the film looked really good. And it looked as though, I mean, one thing that I was particularly impressed with is it's quite difficult in a comedy film, which tends to be very bright, to get these dark moments in them as well. And I thought that they did a really good job in terms of creating these dark, scary places like inside barns. So you would move from a bright daylight outside into these cool, dark spaces. And yeah, I thought that the balance between the two worked really well.
Yeah, I thought they used cinematography really well to establish the horror aspect of the movie because it was such a hilarious movie. I was laughing pretty much every second of the film, but they did still manage to establish horror scenes and scenes that were a little bit terrifying that you weren't sure what to expect, and I thought that was good. That was really good.
Very good.
Definitely the strong point of this film is the comedy. Just comedy all throughout. Every scene. That I was just completely on the floor laughing. I really love scenes where it's ridiculous and they point out how ridiculous it is or how terrifying it is. It's just always great to know that the characters are kind of self-aware to some respect.
Yeah, and it's got a wide variety of comedy as well. It's got visual gags, it's got verbal gags. It's got some verbal gags that are really very clever as well. I mean, just things like the brothers are confronting each other. What have you done? And the older brother says, he's done this human sheep hybrid through genetic engineering. And Henry says, "You fucker." And Angus says, "Well, no, actually, I think they took a sample of semen." So Henry says, "You wanker."
Yeah.
So it's the kind of stuff that you have to sort of think about for a moment. But it's very good. I mean, it has to be said, some of the jokes are a bit dumb. I mean, but because the film builds up such a wellspring of rapport with the audience, you kind of go with even the dumb gags, like the moment where a bottle of mint sauce is flicked on one of the were sheep, and it's like it's holy water on a vampire or something.
It's so good. I actually thought that was hilarious.
It is hilarious, but at the same it's sort of groan laughing. It's sort of, oh no, that's ridiculous. But I still enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It has to be said.
Yeah, I felt that some of the gags had really great setups as well. Like there's one scene where they're trying to escape from the sheep and they're in the Land Rover. And it's Henry, Tucker, and Experience, and Tucker is driving, and then the sheep is also in the cabin with Tucker, so Tucker's trying to wrestle with the sheep and he manages to get away, and they're just three of them on the back of this truck, and Experience just asks Tucker, who's driving, and it's just a shot of the sheep behind the wheel. It's the most hilarious thing I've ever seen on the screen. It's so good.
Well, that's right, because the audience is one step ahead. So you're just waiting for this shot of, go on, show me a shot of the sheep behind the wheel. And you get it. And that's what I mean. There's such a it sort of even sets up expectations and then gives the audience what it wants, which is it's just lovely. It's a collaborative thing with the audience. So it's
Yeah.
not just surprising you; it's also bringing you along for the ride, which is really fun.
I think another thing that really adds to that ride is the sound design, which was just, again, hilarious because it was so over the top. Because often you would see you would see scenes where it's just 10 normal sheep just trotting down a hill, but you hear this rabid snarling animals, and it sounds like a stampede of 1,000 sheep going down the hill. So I think where this film lacks sometimes with its visual effects, I feel like it's made up by sound design.
Yeah, there are little things like you mentioned in that the scene in the Land Rover when Tucker is fighting with the obviously puppet sheep. There's that lovely touch that he grabs hold of it and pushes it towards the steering wheel, and every time he does so, it sets off the horn. So you've just got this car horn going off constantly. But yeah, everything is dialed up to 11. The sounds are so loud when they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And the music as well. Yeah, the music is by Victoria Kelly, and it's definitely in on the gag. It's not one of those scores where it's playing at odds, like it's trying to play it straight and be serious horror. It's amped up to 11 and very jolly and almost Elfman-esque, I would say, in terms of its... It shifts between this beautiful pastoral stuff at the beginning, which is lovely full orchestral music for the childhood days on the farm.
Yes.
And just goes into sort of sprightly, plucky, bouncy, ridiculous stuff for the sheep rampage that breaks out on the island shortly afterwards.
I actually found some of the score was quite reminiscent of some. I always say this, but like Hitchcock films. So quite
Really?
I mean, maybe not Hitchcock, but Bernard Herrmann scores where they're very relentless. They just keep going and going and going, and it has this kind of charging effect to some of the scenes, I guess, to reflect the charging sheep coming to eat your flesh. And yeah, I don't know. I thought some of the very more tense moments were very well orchestrated and score wise, and although obviously very reminiscent of other horror scores, like I felt like it wasn't trying to be original. It was just trying to be a tribute to other horror movies and to kind of establish that sense of tension and horror, I guess.
Yeah, but it's slightly arched though. It is it's pushed slightly too far, so that it's never deathly serious, the music.
No, that's true.
Yeah, it's pitched exactly right, I think. Really complements it well.
Yeah, and in terms of some of the sound design, I love how they used the same sounds for the gut-wrenching sheep eating flesh to also the same sounds when Mrs. Mac is just preparing dinner. or Mike the farmer, he just slops some beans and sausages into a pot, and it sounds like guts falling into a pot. It's great.
Yeah, nothing about this film is subtle.
No.
Not at all.
The sound designer Tim Preble must have had a load of fun making horrific, squelchy gut sounds, which listeners out there, if you don't know, all guts in movies are just fruit and vegetables. So you probably just had a table full of melons and watermelon and pineapple and just like squelching it around with his fists or whatever.
Yeah, I hear lasagna is quite a good one as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have found that cabbage is a great vegetable for sound design.
Really?
It's really great. It sounds like crunching bones a lot of the time. So it's I've been using it a lot recently. So tips to sound designers: get yourself a cabbage.
In terms of textual analysis and themes, I have to say I don't think this film's really going for any lofty themes or social commentary. It's not doing something like, again, Shaun of the Dead is very sophisticated in terms of the social themes that it's mocking. I mean, there's some nice circularity in the film. So, in the way that Shaun of the Dead at the beginning, you're introduced to people shuffling along, staring at their mobile phones, which is a comment on the zombies of today, how we're all enslaved by
Society.
social media. Yeah. And then later on, the same people are doing the same things. But this film does have some nice circular references. So you've got the thing that sort of terrifies Henry at the beginning is somebody dressed up like a sheep shambling around in a barn. And that's exactly what happens to him with his first encounter with Grant, the were-sheep, later on. And they even look sort of the same, tall guy with a sheep slapped on top of him. So, there's some nice circularity in there. Some nice touches, but yeah, I don't get the sense that it was really going for anything grander than that. I mean, even the title, Black Sheep, one of the things that the director and Nathan Meister talk about on the commentary is, who is the black sheep? Because none of the meat-eating sheep are black.
No.
So who is the black sheep of the title? What's it referring to? I noticed that Angus's plane has BLK on it as its tail number. I didn't know whether that was supposed to be a reference. Because the idea is that maybe he's the black sheep, because when you first meet him as a child, he has a leg brace.
Yes.
And it made you think as though the reason he's sort of resentful towards Henry is because he's got a good relationship with his dad and with Tucker, and he's out doing the farming and everything's fine, whereas maybe he's stuck at home because he's not able-bodied and he's bitter, and that's the whole springboard for all of his nefarious doings later on. But that's not really developed in any meaningful way. And then maybe Henry's the black sheep because he's sort of the estranged family member that's coming back and doesn't like sheep anymore. I don't know. So there are sort of little touches around the edges, but I don't think it's doing anything grand necessarily.
There's also the fact that there are environmentalist characters, and they've gone to the farm to investigate a possible experimentation on animals. So there's that aspect of farming and modern science and whereas the farm industry, agriculture industry going with GM and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it kind of pokes fun at that because the environmentalist characters are ridiculous and over the top and have no idea what they're doing. and even at the end they even talk about, oh, maybe we should go organic, but then they kind of brush it off, saying, no, we should just do what we've always been doing.
Yeah, and of course the environmentalists are responsible for the whole outbreak in the first case, which
Exactly,
it actually is very similar to 28 Days Later, because it's environmental activists that unleash the zombie infection in 28 Days Later.
Ah, yes.
Which was released in 2002, so came before this and may have been an influence.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess it didn't really have any clear social commentary or overarching message. It was just kind of having a bit of a fun romp with some killer sheep and making just a genuinely funny movie, which I don't often see. In terms of black comedy and horror, I find it can be really hit and miss. Like if you go too far, you can't take it seriously, but if you go too serious, then it becomes a terrible movie. So I don't know. It can be quite a balance to make it funny but still enjoyable, which I think Black Sheep does.
Yeah, it does, and I think it all ties back into what you said right at the very beginning, which is that it's just self-deprecating. It's not taking any of these positions too seriously. It's just poking fun at all of them. All of these people are equally ridiculous, and all of these themes are equally ridiculous, and we're all a little bit ridiculous. And at the end of it, they've got through it. They've managed to cure all the were sheep by let me get this right. Drenching them. Yes, it's called drenching, apparently. This thing where you just like jam a metal tube in someone's mouth and squirt something.
Yes.
It's for usually worming or something. But
Right.
yeah, they managed to cure them. And so everybody can go back to normal and just being sensible on the farm. And Mrs. Mac is probably shredding and cooking up another rabbit ready for tea. I think that's the sense that I got from it.
Coming to you live from the Movie Oubliette Theatre, it's the prestigious Mobley Awards.
Time now for the coveted Mobley Awards. This is where Dan and I nominate some of our favourite parts of the film in a number of ridiculous and pointless categories. As always, we kick off with favourite quote. There's lots of lovely quotable dialogue in this movie. Dan, what was your particular favourite?
Just so many favorite quotes.
We've quoted a lot of them already.
Yeah, there was one. It's a bit of a long quote from experience. So I really like this quote because I'm pretty sure I've heard someone say this exact thing to me or something along the lines. So she's talking to Tucker, I think, after they've just been confronted by these killer sheep, and she says, I would have thought that you, of all people, would appreciate the efforts to deconstruct the colonialist, paternalist, agrarian hierarchy that disenfranchises tangata whenua and erodes the natural resources of Aotearoa. In which Tucker replies, learn all that at university, did you, before you dropped out? I love it.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of the bar scene in Good Will Hunting, where some students are talking about these things that they like and these things that they don't. And
Yes.
Will points out that they only think that because they're in year one and they're being taught these texts, and in year two they'll change their minds to this, and then in year three they'll discover this, and they're just spouting what they've been told. And,
Yes.
yeah. And Tucker is much more down to earth and just gets on with things, which is great. My favourite is just a little play on the wonderful bestiality that the movie revels in.
Yes.
So, when Henry discovers that his brother Angus has had a romantic time with the Uber sheep, he says, "You've got a fucked up idea of animal husbandry."
Oh, it's so great.
It's so great. It's a lovely play on words, which I really enjoyed. So, most naughties moment. Is there something in here that's particularly naughties? I mean, I thought about the shaky cam, but I think that was a sort of necessity rather than anything else. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of shaky cam action in this.
I mean, the only naughties thing I found was it's a very naughties horror thing. So, in the Tucker transformation scene, so he's kind of flicking between being human and being this were-sheep, and it uses that fast-forwarded head-shaking footage kind of thing, where he's just shaking his head, and then the fast-forwarded it, so it's just a blur of his head kind of wobbling backwards and forwards. It's very, very prevalent in the noughties, especially with all those Ring Japanese rip-off movies.
Yeah, it's an effect I actually first remember seeing in Adrian Lyne's Jacob's Ladder with Tim Robbins, which was
yes.
1991. So, yeah, but quite popular in the noughties.
Yes.
In terms of best hair or costume, I didn't have anything in particular. I thought that certainly the environmentalists were, very typically decked out in terms of their costumes and hair.
I would agree that environmentalists kind of stood out, only because Grant, I kind of used to dress like him. And
Really?
So I used to have kind of long hair, and I had a goatee for a while, and used to have one of those side satchels with a whole bunch of patches sewn on it. And I didn't walk around in a waistcoat though, so I feel like it wasn't as bad. But yeah, I thought he was hilarious because I was just like, wow, that was me when I was in my 20s. Favorite scene?
Well, we've already talked about it, but my favourite scene is the Land Rover chase. Well, it's not a chase really, but it's just such a fantastic freewheeling
Yes.
action scene with so many hilarious things happening in it. I mean, I think just the combination of Tucker fighting with this obviously fake sheep in the driver's seat, whilst Henry's on the flatbed in the back trying to get a chainsaw working. And he goes through this whole sequence of, have you turned it on? Which again comes from experience, which is very practical. But yes, he turns it on and rolls his eyes, and then Tucker says, have you primed it? And then finally, after all of this, when he pulls the ripcord and starts it, it starts up with such force that he just hurls it over the side. So it's just totally pointless. All this build-up, and it was a complete waste of time. And then the honking of the horn and the sheep driving, and it's just non-stop laughs. That sequence, it's great.
I also liked it because a chainsaw is such a cliche in zombie movies. There's always a chainsaw, and so having the chainsaw and then for it to not even be usable because he flings it over the side is so hilarious.
What about you? What was your favourite scene?
Oh, there's just so many favorite scenes, but I really did like the big sheep attack scene. So this is at the sheep conference, I guess you would call it.
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
So Angus is addressing a collection of sheep moguls on this paddock, and then a big herd of sheep proceeds to rampage and attack them. But it's hilarious to me because it's just a normal herd of sheep just trotting through a field with people, but the people are acting hysterically like they're being attacked by these sheep. And then it has all these close-ups of puppet sheep ravaging these people, ripping their throats out and ripping their faces off. And it's just so hilarious because the wide shots are just normal sheep just wandering in this paddock.
Yeah, it sort of revels in its lack of convincing effects, doesn't it? It's quite fun.
Exactly. I love it.
Yeah. So, most cliched horror moment, I guess. And there was my old favourite again, the old transformation scene. Let's stand and watch my brother turn into a were-sheep.
Oh, yes.
For a very long time and not do anything.
Yes.
Including even an American Werewolf homage, which they admit was an American Werewolf homage, where the brother's head turns to the side and the snout pushes out painfully and jerkily. Yeah, so that I thought was a cliche.
Yeah. My most cliche kind of horror moment was when they're in the lab and you've got the scientist lady and her henchman, and they're just waving around these giant needles, because all needles in horror movies have to be giant, the biggest needle possible.
And full of green liquid.
Yeah, exactly. And I love it how they always have to squirt some stuff out the top, because that's what happens in movies. And they always have to tap it as well with their finger.
Oh, yeah.
Because, I mean, I imagine all hospitals and doctors' floors just being completely drenched in all of this liquid that they've been squirting out from needles.
Okay. Favorite effect?
I kind of liked the intermediate kind of sheep, were sheep. So yeah, I mentioned before with big round heads and the bulbous eyes and the sheep teeth. I kind of liked it, even though you could tell it was obviously a big head mask thing over a dude. I thought it was pretty effective.
Yeah, it took sort of 5 people to coordinate the movement on those things, and they got some really good sort of expressive movements sometimes in the particularly in the kitchen scene at the end where he's facing down. Is it his brother or is it Grant? I can't remember which one it is.
Oh, I think it was Grant.
I think it's Grant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Grant. Yeah, so he's the one that gets the dose of mint sauce. Yeah, those are the best effects. Whereas the puppets, let's be honest, they're not very good.
But I think they know that they're not very good, so it's kind of hilarious at the same time.
Yeah, I think they do, but they still have fun with them and they get some funny expressions out of them,
Yes.
including in what I thought was my funniest scene, but I'll come back to that.
Ooh. Favorite sound effect?
Oh, well, for me, actually, I did write down Mrs. Mack's rabbit sounds because It's just ridiculous. I can't imagine. It's almost like she's got a microphone up to it and an amplifier or something. It's so loud, her kitchen preparations. So yeah, I love that. I really enjoyed it. It's so watery and gungy and sticky and horrible.
Oh, it's horrible to listen to in all the best ways. My favorite sound effect was, again, the were sheep. So they're just normal sheep just trotting through a field, and they sound like the most horrific animal alive. So great, snarly, rabid, disgusting teeth, jaw sounds. It's amazing.
Yeah, they didn't underplay it at all, did they?
Yeah, I also love it how they kind of mix it in with just some innocent bar sounds as well. So it's just such a juxtaposition of like normally quite innocuous sounds, but as well as terrifying sounds.
Yeah, it's like little quizzical moments and so on. So, Fake Blood.
I would say this was our highest rated fake blood movie. Like I love the blood in it. It's just so splattery, but not CGI. It's all practical. It's nice, kind of glistening, deep red color. I thought 5 stars, I would say.
Yeah, I would say so. It's the best we've had so far because we keep coming up against movies where there just isn't any blood.
Yeah, exactly.
or what little there is like not very good. But this is the good stuff. New Zealand knows its blood.
Yes. I would also like to mention the guts. I loved the guts, how the sheep would pull skin and guts from people, and it was this really stretchy, elastic kind of consistency, which is I love that. It's very reminiscent of 80s splatter horror films where skin is just so stretchy.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is, whether it's latex or whether it's sausage skins. I know they use quite often these types of effects, but yeah, it looks disgusting. Whatever it is.
Gross, very gross.
Funniest scene, whether intended or not intended. I think it's got to be all intentional in this, hasn't it, really?
Yeah, I think so too.
Out of all of the scenes, which would you say is the funniest?
I mean, every scene is hilarious, but there's in the big sheep attack scene again, there's this one guy, he's had his leg bitten right off, and he's trying to escape this sheep, and he throws like whatever he can find, and that happens to be his severed leg. Which it's just so horrifying that the only way to defend himself is by throwing his own severed leg.
Yeah, quite ironic to throw a leg at a lamb.
Yeah, apparently as well that guy is an actual amputee. And so he doesn't actually have a leg. So
no, I know, and I always feel of two minds about that. Whenever they use amputees in films for special effects where people lose limbs, I think, isn't that just a bit sort of in bad taste? How do they feel about that? But they're stunt guys that specialize in this stuff, so maybe they're okay with it.
Yeah, I would say they're okay with it.
I hope so.
Unless they get typecast as the guy that always loses his leg.
Yeah, I guess so. For me, it has to be the scene where Henry is trying to make his way through a herd of sheep surreptitiously by coating himself in the seat covers, sheepskin seat covers from a car, which apparently are de rigueur in New Zealand. You can find these everywhere. And as he's midway through on all fours, he gets the amorous attention of one of the other sheep, which mounts him.
Yes.
He looks in between his arms and can see some very large testicles slapping around and prods them with a sharp implement. I think his Golden Shears Award from when he was a child.
Yes.
And there is a fantastic expression from the puppet sheep in reaction to getting stabbed in these delicate parts. And that did make me roar with laughter. Although, it has to be said, I was somewhat confused that these mutant sheep have testicles, because aren't sheep girls? All of them? Don't you have to be a ram to be a boy? So I was a little bit confused.
know.
But maybe it's all the genetics.
Maybe.
Weird things are happening on this farm.
So that concludes the Moobly Awards.
Woo!
Welcome back, and it's that time for the final verdict. So, should this film be thrown in a hole of discarded sheep fetuses, or should it be released from the paddocks to be enjoyed by all? Conrad, you've never seen this film before. What's your verdict?
Well, I have to say, I had some reservations about the film. I think if you compare it to something like Shaun of the Dead, which was a few years before, I don't think it's nearly as inventive or as sophisticated visually or thematically. And I think that there are quite a few things that you could say it's derivative of. I mean, we've mentioned 28 Days Later. We've mentioned Shaun of the Dead. Obviously, there's Dog Soldiers is in there as well. I don't know if you've seen that. There are quite a few things, and even the rape scene where Henry is mounted by a sheep is reminiscent of something that happens in the Zucker brothers movie Top Secret from the 80s. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No, I haven't seen that.
It's very funny. There is a moment where two people try to break into a Nazi camp disguised as a cow. Unfortunately, a bull finds them. So the guy that's at the back has an unpleasant time.
Okay.
So it's sort of a derivative, and also, there are things in it that I thought were a little bit dumb, like the bastard is a bit silly, and the dog barring right at the very end.
Yes.
It's the sort of comedy where it throws everything up at the wall and just sees what sticks. But the thing is that it pretty much all does stick, and that's the thing. I had such a good time watching it, and it generates such a strong sense of goodwill from the audience, because it really does bring you along for the ride and poke fun at everybody and everything. And yet at the same time, it's technically, given the restrictions they're working under, so accomplished. I mean, the effects are good, even if in cases where they are silly. The cinematography is beautiful. The acting is pretty good, except for a few moments. But and it does an awful lot with not much, and manages to look pretty polished at the same time. So I think bottom line is it's just a rip-roaring good time, and I would recommend anybody watch it, to be honest, because if you want 90 minutes of just ridiculous fun, I think this is what you should drop into your DVD player or your streaming service. Q.
Yes, I would agree 100%. It's just a fun, rollicking ride, and you just have to suspend all your disbelief and just enjoy the ridiculousness. And there are so many good lines, and it does, writing-wise, it's so well written with the jokes and the gags and the setups. I love it.
Yeah.
Watching it a second time, I hadn't seen it for a few years, and it's just as good as how I remembered it. And yeah, there are a few production aspects of it that could have been better, but overall, I think it's just an amazingly hilarious film that everyone should watch straight away, especially fans of horror, especially the splattery, gory 80s horror. It just nails it like perfectly.
Yeah, it really does. So I think in this case, we're going to drench it against worms and set it free.
Off you go. Join your flock of merry sheep. Kakiteano.
Indeed. Bye for now.
So the question now is, what will we be taking a look at next episode?
So next time we'll be watching a psychological thriller that's actually a remake of a European film, and the remake is directed by the same director, so it's a little bit unusual. It's the 1993 thriller The Vanishing.
Ah, I haven't seen that. Or the original.
No, it stars Jeff Bridges, Kiefer Sutherland, Nancy Travis, and was the first screen appearance of one Sandra Bullock. So,
Wow,
yes,
okay.
a fascinating film to look back on, and one that people have either maligned and forgotten or have never heard of. So I think we'll have a lot of fun looking at this dark thriller.
Ah, can't wait.
Yes, and if anyone listening out there has ideas for what film we could look at in a future episode, please let us know and comment on what we've said today and what you think of Black Sheep. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to follow us, we're on Instagram and Twitter, all under the same handle, which is Movie Oubliette. And if you're not sure how to spell Oubliette, it is...
Oubliette.
Ah, sorry, just having a cup of tea and an Anzac biscuit. What was that?
Oubliette.
And don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or whatever podcasting platform you're using to consume us, because we love to hear from you.
Always good to hear from our beloved fans.
Indeed, yes.
And we might even say your name on a podcast.
We might even read you out, you never know. Yes, but thanks for everyone for joining us yet again for Movie Oubliette. I'm Conrad.
And I'm Dan.
Goodbye for now.
Ciao, 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 ciao.
We review the films others tend to forget. Come with us and open up the movie Oubliette.